What does it take to be a hands-on church? That's the question of the 4-week stewardship series that we began last Sunday. For those of you who were here. If you were here last week, you know that my friend John Brewer recently retired from Faith Church in Issaquah, Faith United Methodist Church in Issaquah, came and kicked off our series with the theme on connection. That was our starting week series. It's exhausting. Well, that's not right. Yes, it is. For a minute I thought, wait, where'd that slide come from? If you think about connection and the need for it in our church to be a hands-on church, you can do hands-on ministry by yourself, but it is exhausting to do it by yourself. It may even be impossible to maintain it without being connected to one another, to the larger church, the larger United Methodist Church, the body of Christ, and most importantly, to God. As John reminded us last week, he said, your future is in God's hands. Like the church in Colossae, Paul encourages us, he said, to know and understand what the will of God is. And he went on to say, this is how you first begin to get directions as a congregation or as a conference. What is the will of God for you as an individual, as a small group, as a Bible study, as a congregation? Come to know the will of God. What is the will of God for you and for your life, John said. You do that by living a life that's worthy of Christ. Now, I would also like to say something about the challenge that John put to all of us. If you were here, you heard it. And that was to increase your pledge for 2015, to increase your giving for 2015 by at least 10%. Is that what you heard? Because I went and listened to it again. I wanted to make sure that's what I heard. Now, what I want to say about it is I want to acknowledge that some of you are not able to do that. Some of you do not have the capacity to increase your giving by 10% or at all for any number of reasons. In fact, some of you may be like a neighbor of mine who was recently laid off from Microsoft, and maybe they are considering reducing or not even being able to give right now because no work is coming. But some of you, like some of my other neighbors who work at Microsoft, recently received sizable bonuses. So let me be clear. When you hear in the next couple of weeks, and right now, someone challenge you to increase your giving this year, that challenge is for those who have the capacity for such an increase. And let me also say, some of you, while some of you may need to decrease because of the capacity you have right now and the circumstances you're in, some of you have the capacity to increase your giving by 10% or 20% or 25% or more, and you won't even notice it. So I don't want to stop at 10%. I want to challenge you, as we have been challenging each other in the stewardship team, to make a significant increase for us. And we as individuals or as a household are the only ones who can determine that. And again, within your capacity. And some of you don't have the capacity for that, and I recognize that. So don't hear that challenge and feel guilty. If I could talk to each one of you separately, we would do that. But Sunday mornings, that's kind of how it goes. Now, having said that, this week we'll consider the second element of our series and what's required to be a hands-on church, and that is compassion. As some of you know or have heard me say before, the literal meaning of the Latin roots for the word compassion are with suffering or suffering with. So to have compassion could either mean to suffer with someone, to feel their pain, to be in solidarity with someone who is suffering, or it could mean to be with someone in their suffering. To be present, to bear witness, as someone has said repeatedly to me. I will bear witness to your life and your suffering. To not turn away from the suffering of someone else. Those might not sound like very different things, but as I'm studying and learning more about compassion, there's a significant difference between suffering with someone and being with someone in their suffering. I don't know if you're nodding or just kind of, I don't know what the difference is. And that's okay, because I didn't think too much about it before I started reading. But some neuroscientists suggest that suffering with someone is one part of the process as we move toward being with those who are suffering. That one of those neuroscientists, Tanya Singer, believes that feeling the suffering of another is not compassion. Suffering with someone, in other words, is not compassion. It's empathy. That we have the capacity to actually feel the suffering of another person, or to suffer when we witness the suffering of another person. Now, I will say, I have a tendency to faint when I am with people who are in tremendous pain. This is a pastoral problem because, for whatever reason, people in pain sometimes call their pastor. And I am very clear, it's not supposed to be about me. But when you pass out, or almost pass out, suddenly it becomes about me. That's not my goal. But what I've learned is, I might be over-empathizing with people, taking their pain on to the degree that I can't bear it. Now, that's not a bad thing in and of itself, but it's not compassion, is what they're saying. Most of our brains are literally hardwired with mirroring neurons that allow us to put ourselves into the place of another, to be outside of ourselves and then experience something that we're not really experiencing, to feel something of what the other is feeling. This is why when we're watching a movie, some of us feel like we're in the movie. The adrenaline, the fear, the passion and romance, whatever it is, that we can put ourselves in the movie. We're on our couch in our living room, but we're suddenly in some jungle in who knows where, and we're feeling it. It's a great experience for those of us who have that capacity. I don't know what the rest of you are doing, but it's not worth $12 to me. The problem with empathy is that it can be exhausting, particularly those who are surrounded by people who are suffering, be it healthcare providers, those who deal with palliative care and end of life, hospice, first responders, and others, maybe even pastors who sometimes find themselves regularly in places where people are suffering all the time. Or it can be those who didn't choose to be surrounded by suffering, those who didn't go into a career to be surrounded by those who are suffering, but because of war or natural disaster or some other cause, they have no choice. They're in it and they're surrounded by it. Their own suffering and the suffering of others. Empathy can lead to exhaustion, or what some mistakenly call compassion fatigue. I learned that recently, but as I've learned more, I don't think there really is such a thing as compassion fatigue. What they're describing is empathy fatigue. The neuroscientists suggest, however, that empathy is necessary for us to move toward compassion. Not only might it lead to exhaustion, but it's also necessary as we move toward compassion. It may lead us toward compassion. It's a step in the right direction. You have to have that first before you can move toward compassion. Now, without going too much into the science of it, because I'm not sure I get it all, and I was a little overwhelmed just by reading it, and you listening to it, I'm not sure. But I encourage you to look up Tanya Singer if you're so interested. One of the key differences between compassion and empathy is the intention to transform suffering. Not just alleviate it, not eliminate it necessarily, but to transform it. That is not to say that compassion is unfeeling or cold, but that the compassionate person is able to be with someone in their suffering and to do what is possible to transform their suffering, to give it some other meaning or experience for themselves and the other. And if possible, of course, to decrease their suffering. While we may not be able to cure the dying patient or simply lift someone out of their painful circumstances, we may transform the suffering of another through self-awareness and the intention of decreasing suffering for others. Now, I share all this because I have struggled with the question of why some people seem to lack compassion entirely or significantly, while others seem to have a limitless capacity. How can the Mother Teresas and the Dalai Lamas of the world live a lifetime of compassion without being exhausted, and others seem unwilling to even look on the suffering of another person? An example of that. I read an article recently about a 33-story glassy tower that's been built on Manhattan's waterfront above the Hudson River that will offer all the extras that a condo buyer paying up to $25 million would expect. Like concierge service, entertainment rooms, unobstructed views of the Hudson River and miles beyond. And because the city is in desperate need of affordable housing, builders are allowed to have, like this one, have larger projects with generous subsidies and tax breaks as long as they plan to include a certain percentage of low-income apartments. And so this luxurious building, and it's not a one-of-a-kind thing. This has happened in New York before and in London and in other places. But this luxurious building will cater to renters who make no more than $50,000, which sounds great. However, these renters will not share the same perks. As it turns out, they will also not share the same entrance. According to their application for the building, the people who built the building say that the residents in the more affordable apartments will have their own entryway in the back alley behind the building. Now, when asked about the so-called poor door, a company spokesman said, "No one ever said that the goal was full integration of these populations." Probably true. And as one writer put it, someone might have said that, like Isaiah or Jesus, but what did they know about 21st century New York City real estate? The spokesman also said, "I think it's unfair to expect very high-income homeowners who paid a fortune to live in their building to have to be in the same boat as low-income renters who are very fortunate to live in a new building in a great neighborhood." That would make me feel very fortunate. Again, I struggle with the question of why or how. How are some people able to have such a limitless capacity for compassion and others unwilling or unable to even look on the suffering of others? I have lots of theories, but they're my theories. You probably have some of your own. I wonder if it's exhaustion of empathy, or if it's just apathy, or lack of exposure to suffering in general, wanting to protect yourself. I don't know. There's lots of things. Feeling like it's out of my element, out of my context, out of my culture. I don't know. Some of us, though, have been forced to struggle with those same questions here at this church because of our intention to be a hands-on church, a church that continues to move toward acts of compassion. We've had to consider how we will respond to the suffering and the needs of others around us. We've had to ask ourselves if we are willing to be with others who are suffering, who are in need, in some physical way, without looking away. And maybe how we will continue to do that without being exhausted or worn out or jaded or apathetic or fatigued. How will we respond even when we do not have a cure, even when we cannot lift someone out of their circumstances, even when the needs seem to be overwhelming? Will we let our empathy exhaust us until we require suffering to use a different door? Or will we continue to learn and grow into a life of compassion? Frankly, you've heard enough from me. So I want to ask someone who has also struggled with me and with us with that question to come up and share his story and his family's story. So Hal, if you would. I don't know if all of you know Hal Duong, but this is him. Yeah, you will find out more.
So thank you, Kelly, for inviting me to speak about personal experience on the matter of compassion. Just going to start up my little talk here. So my name's Hal Duong. I'm married to Taryn Klobowski, and we have two wonderful kids in Sunday school right now. And like many other parents, and many of you in the congregation, Taryn and I work really hard at trying to protect our kids from suffering, from all the suffering that we saw in the PowerPoint and in the photos. We want to make sure that our kids don't have to worry about whether or not their next meal will fill their stomachs or if their surroundings are clean enough to prevent illness. We want to make sure that there's enough heat in the house to keep them warm on a cold night. And we want to make sure that they are safe in their beds at night. But we also recognize and want our kids to recognize that there's a bigger world out there, one where others don't have that luxury. Not everybody is protected from suffering. And so when the Safe Parking program started, we thought, wow, this would be a great opportunity to expose our kids and help them to develop the compassion and in our own little way try to alleviate some of the suffering. So I don't know how long ago that was, but the volunteering that we did was on a Tuesday night, and it started off just fine. There were not many safe parkers at the time, so it was really great. We got to know everybody individually and got to spend a lot of time with some of the parkers. And, we started bringing dinner in. As we had to eat ourselves, we decided to share that meal with others. And so what started off as just sharing food with others became more of a sharing and a development of a fellowship with the safe parkers. And finally, it became kind of dinner with friends because we got to know some of the parkers so well. And this was all great. We really were getting a lot out of it, and we're sensing that they were getting a lot out of this as well. But then winter rolled around, and it became harder. And why did it become harder? In order for me to explain that, I have to take a step back. Many years ago when I was in college, a roommate and I, on a Saturday night, put a few bucks in our pockets and decided to go out and do what college kids do on Saturday nights, which was go to a party. And so we walked down one of the main streets in our college town, and we're quickly headed off and encountered a homeless person. This homeless person, this gentleman, approached us and asked us for a few bucks. And I did what most people do, and what I've done numerous times, is kind of looked away, shook my head a little bit, and kept walking, and maybe walked a little faster than I did before. So after I kind of passed that moment up, I looked back at my roommate and found that he wasn't next to me anymore. He had actually stopped to engage the homeless person. What he essentially said to the homeless person is, I don't have money to give you, but I'll take you to the restaurant right there and buy you food. And so they both went to the restaurant, and I stood outside, kind of asking myself, why couldn't I do that? Why didn't I do that? And as most people do, I came up with numerous reasons. Well, I'm a college student. I don't have a lot of money to give. I'm busy studying, so I don't have a lot of time to devote to this. And, does he really want money for food, or did he want money for other illicit uses? So I rationalized all that, and I said to myself, this moment means a lot to me. And some point in the future, I will have more money, I will have more time, and I'll have the ability to make sure that my money gets used well. And at that point, I'll be ready to engage. Well, so that takes me back to the safe parking situation. So when winter rolled around again, Tara and I, found it hard because there was a need. And the need was to keep the safe parkers warm. And we really didn't have any more excuses. We have the money, we have the time, we knew whatever we did would go to a good cause and to those who really need it. We just couldn't walk the safe parkers out of this semi-warm church to their code cars, knowing that that is where they're going to spend the next 10 hours. So when the opportunity came up to not just be there as someone with others who are suffering, but to actually help alleviate it, we could not just walk away and say we were too busy. We got out of our comfort zone and did something that we normally would only do for family. And that helped get a family out of their car. So another side note, I am a refugee of the Vietnam War. I came over to the U.S. on a fishing boat. Had it not been for the compassion of a couple of healers on that boat shortly after we left, I would not have survived that trip because I was suffering from dysentery at the time. Had it not been the compassion for the Singapore Navy, all 250 of us on that boat would have drowned in the Indian Ocean. Had it not been for the compassion of a Christian family who had 7 kids of their own, they brought us in, kept us warm, and supported us so that we could survive the middle of winter in Wisconsin. We wanted to make sure, Taryn and I, that when the time came, someone could say, had it not been the compassion for this family, we would still be sleeping in a cold car. And had it not been for the compassion of this congregation and the congregation's acceptance of the plundering of your possessions, as we heard, none of this would be possible. So please consider what your past excuses are and see if it's within your ability to give a little more. Thanks.
Paul wrote in the letter to the Hebrews, recall those earlier days when, after you had been enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to abuse and persecution, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion for those who were in prison, and you cheerfully accepted the plundering of your possessions, knowing that you yourselves possess something better, even more lasting.